Well, hello and welcome to another episode of the New Ground Life and Leadership Podcast, here to help you thrive as a follower of Jesus wherever you are and in whatever you're going through. In today's episode, I caught up with Emma Goulds, who's the co-founder of Orchardsuk, a charity that works in partnership with local churches to support women who've experienced different forms of sexual exploitation. Emma is a leader at Beacon Church London and is also a mum of 3 children. Now, I should say that we recorded this conversation before the recent murder of Sarah Everard, which would explain why there's no specific reference to her death, but nevertheless perhaps serves to underscore why this is a topic that's worthy of your time and open consideration. Emma recently published a blog on her church website in which she wrote, "Before we rush into trying to fix this, or before we move on, we need to recognise that there are families mourning. There are daughters and sisters in our churches and in our communities who are mourning, and we need brothers and sisters together to really hear these stories, cry out to God in lament, and allow spaces for the wounds that are surfacing to be acknowledged and healed." She then goes on to issue a call for prayer and culture change in our churches. And as with so many of these things, it's up to each of us to engage and pray and to essentially build the church that we believe reflects the best vision of Jesus for the world. I'll put a link to the article in the description for this episode. I'm so grateful for Emma's courage in sharing what she does in this episode, and also for her time and our time together. I pray that it really encourages you and speaks to you. With all that said, I'm going to hand over to my conversation with Emma, in which I started by asking the question, tell us about something you've learned in the past 6 months, either about yourself or leadership. Enjoy.
Lots of things. I suppose one thing I've been reflecting on in particular, in terms of my walk with God in the current situation in leadership context, and it sounds quite fluffy maybe or simple, but just the importance of prioritizing rest in God. The reason that I say that, I think, very, very common situations for all of us as lockdown started. I have 3 kids and 3 jobs, and as lockdown began, so I lead pastoral care in our church, and we completely changed how we were doing pastoral care because of the current situation, because people were struggling. There were a lot of major issues coming up all at the same time. I'm sure this is very common for churches around the country. We have what we call Grace Centre Ministries attached to the church. That will be CAP, Food Bank, and Orchards. And as more people were struggling within the local community, but also beginning to join the wider church, lots of major issues are coming up all at the same time. Lots of safeguarding issues were coming up all at the same time, and so for me, had the classic home learning and lots of meetings, but I was in meetings every single evening, and my phone was just going all the time with emergencies. And with Orchards, we set up a new safe property, and which was wonderful, but there challenging things happening through that, and it was a woman who very sadly didn't make it within the referral process. So within that context, I was at the point of working through burnout, really, and so I've been, the last 6 months has been a real shift in me in the way that I function. Not that there's hugely more spaciousness, because I still have 3 children, still have 3 jobs. I think there's been prioritizing rest in God. So for me, some of that is a practical thing. I've got where the boundaries go, don't they, when you're suddenly at home and kids are at home and ministry is at home and work's at home, needing to practically put in some new boundaries. So I am quite dogmatic at the moment about only doing 1 evening meeting a week, and turning off all of my devices for 24 hours once a week. I'm not saying that that's what everybody should do, but for me that created a bit of a spaciousness. But also my walk with him, where you're going into you know, as a leader, if you're going into meetings back to back, and maybe in one you're speaking about finance, and the next one you're speaking about there's a pastoral issue, and maybe the next one you're training leaders on something, and then, you know, and then, but there isn't the headspace, because you know, you might have been watching Peppa Pig before it starts, to you know, really regroup, just doing it from a place of, okay, God, what is it that you want me to say in this meeting? What is it that you want me to say? Because you put me here, and you know, I carry your presence because I'm full of the Holy Spirit, and I'm here. So what is it that you want me to say? And then regrouping afterwards, and you know, were we connected, God? And did I say that thing, rather than, you know, what did this person think, or, you know, all of that kind of thing. So it's very, you know, there's the sort of simplicity of it, but just the fruitfulness from functioning more in that place, because he doesn't need me, he doesn't need us, but you know, that where there's sort of faith present, he can work through us. So I think they're just being intentional about resting in God. So that's a big thing for me. And I think the other thing, again, sounds very simple, is the real importance of the local church as being a, you know, a place where, you know, if we are understanding and engaging the things that are going on in our local communities, and we shape kingdom culture is in such a way within our churches, that the local church really can be a place of healing from a whole number of things, but also a place of culture transformation. And that sounds, well, you know, I'm sure everybody listening is pro the local church, but to really understand, so what does that look like if we really understand the sort of hypersexualization in culture? What does that mean if we really understand that, but created, you know, and are able to engage, and we create kingdom culture in our churches? What does that look like if we really understand domestic abuse? What does that look like if we really understand, you know, racial injustice? And I know that you've had Owen Hilton on this podcast, and he would have spoken about the reconciled church, and that's something that we are grappling with a lot within our church. How do we do this, you know, not in a surface level way, but how do we really engage in our hearts, in our minds, in our relationships, in our preaching, in our speaking, in our spheres of leadership influence, so that there is church culture created where healing from injustice can happen, but also where we begin to shape culture.
Wow, that's a lot that you're wrestling with and grappling with, isn't it? You've got a lot of kind of heavy responsibilities, or heavy, for want of a better term, really big responsibilities involved in trying to care and serve people in a wide spectrum of your life. I imagine it must be very difficult to switch, as you said, from one responsibility or one thought process to the other. How do you, so you talk about the importance of rest, and by the way, I'm with you on the 24 hours turning off all devices. That for me it's like an oasis. I love that. So I think everybody should have a day without their phone. It's a dream. But the challenge, like you mentioned, of Peppa Pig preparing you for a finance meeting, or helping you to sit with someone going through some difficulties. So you're obviously someone who's involved in the coalface of some social challenges, and listening to a lot of heartbreaking, heart-wrenching stories. How do you stop yourself from either being crushed under the weight of wanting to fix it and not be able to fix everybody's problems, or just kind of getting quite, people go one of two ways, I've observed. They can either become, you know, crushed under the weight of I must fix everybody's problems, or you can end up being quite cold and, you know, bureaucratic and just, you know, computer says no. How do you guard your heart in that respect?
That's a really good question. I think God has been so kind to me in that it was a very, very gradual journey into being involved in these things. So you know, sexual exploitation, for example, it's something that God put on my heart for a very long time. I mean, maybe almost 20 years. And I probably just before I became Christian, I was, you know, something I was passionate about, although perhaps in a less healthy way. And very as a very new Christian, was involved in prison ministry in a women's prison, and would see, you know, almost as a baseline, women in there would struggle with self-harm and would have been raped, and a lot of them were self-harming to stay in prison because it was better than what they had to go out to, and would have eating disorders, and and be and huge stories of abuse, and we'd go in there and just see God move, and it was beautiful. And I would do it in small doses because I'd come out and it would touch on my stuff, but I would have sort of faith eyes for that God is moving in this area, and then maybe I'd have a month, and I'd regroup, and I'd be grappling with my stuff, I suppose. And I was involved in halfway housing for women coming out of prison, and an outreach in of street prostitution about 15 years ago in sort of slightly affluent area in London, and it was, I think God kind of increased the dosage of things, and I'd regroup, and there'll be things that he would be healing in my own heart, and I'd have a job at the civil service briefly, years ago, maybe 15 years ago, where I'd be hearing some a lot of safeguarding issues, just all the time, and God taught me to pray, actually, no, God, I give that to you, and so that I wasn't carrying it. And there's a prayer walk of that you would have a soft heart of compassion, but that you're not taking it, and honors your own pain, and at the same time God healing me of some of my own things, so that so I can separate it. And I remember, I got married 11 years ago, and our first year of marriage, God spoke to me really clearly about stopping doing those things just for the first year. And I'm not saying that's the rule for everybody, but that was the case. That was the case for me. So I had been doing some key work with a woman involved in street prostitution. I had been going in. Involved in that Our Street Prostitution project, and I stopped. And it was really hard because it was something that I really, really carried, and actually in some ways it was more tiring not doing it than doing it, because it was something that was so burning on my heart. But it was a really wise decision, because I was able to separate out, and just focus on getting used to being married. And then there was a point when I was ready to go back in again and go into flats, and at that point be able to then come home and separate. This isn't having seen sort of some slightly toxic versions of masculinity in those in those spaces during outreach, coming home and it not being, and this being this doesn't shape here, so that being a separate place. So that was that was one thing. And then there were a few years where I've been doing pastoral care a bit more, and so I think God knew when I was what I was ready for, and there's my own journey of healing and almost that exposure increasing. So he's been so kind to me in that respect. So now I feel very, very held, but you do need to be constantly self-aware. So there might be some fairly major things where I feel fine, and like God gives me the grace for it, and it doesn't affect me, and there might be one or two things that just does get, and having spaces to pray with, there'll be someone that I will then pray that through with, that I'm not, someone challenged me on not becoming a cul-de-sac for abuse stories recently, and just knowing that I've got that almost there's a self-awareness that okay, actually this particular thing I'm feeling quite flat, this has affected me, or I'm getting compassion fatigue, I really do need to just rest a bit. The other thing you mentioned is the challenge of jumping in and trying to fix everything, and I think This is it's probably for anyone involved in pastoral care, but certainly anyone who is supporting people who've experienced abuse. The challenge to rescue can be massive, and I think we can come in with our superhero suits of I'm going to sort this out, and and actually that's for all sorts of reasons not a helpful response. I think my first experience supporting someone with domestic abuse, and it wasn't an official, it was a friend. It must have been 15, 17 years ago, and it was definitely an attempted rescue mission. It was a failed rescue mission. It was an attempted rescue mission, and so we need to just be aware that we're not trying to be someone's savior, that Jesus is a savior. So that's first and foremost, getting ourselves out of the way. Sorry, go on.
No, I know psychologists talk about the trap that you can get into of rescuer, persecutor, and I can't remember what the other one is, but it's this idea that unless someone actually asks you to do something, if you do it for them, you end up becoming their rescuer. You've made them a victim, and therefore, actually, in the long run, that only breeds resentment, and they in turn end up persecuting you and being annoyed at you for helping them in the first place, because you. And I guess getting that balance between the permission you've been given and their responsibility, your professional capacity responsibility, but also the required and requested help, rather than constantly. We can end up infantilizing people who are victims, I guess, by assuming we know what they need and assuming that we're the strong who can help them, the weak. But it's not as straightforward as that, is it? It's a lot more complicated.
No, and I think there's some identity things in that as well. It's interesting, actually. I am trying to stop myself using the phrase vulnerable adults at the moment, and the reason for that is when I reflect on some of the people in my life who you may want to use that term with, actually they're some of the strongest, most resilient, courageous people that I know, and so it just doesn't fit. And so there's something about, am I creating an environment where someone can choose, and that is particularly important where choice has been taken away. So thinking about sexual exploitation, for example, I think it's talked about a lot across Christendom, but usually we're talking about trafficking, and where there's an obvious choice has absolutely physically been taken away, but there's and I think we then had this black and white view of otherwise, in prostitution, that's a choice, right? It's that someone's chosen it or they've been trafficked into it. Actually, the reality is often a lot more grey than that. So someone might be trafficked into prostitution, someone might be trafficked into pornography or coerced. And actually, even if there's not an obvious, person coercing or forcing someone, if you like, there's circumstantial things. So very commonly you might see sexual abuse as a child, very commonly in homelessness. Domestic abuse is one of the biggest reasons for women becoming homeless, and actually lack of housing is one of the biggest entry points into sexual exploitation. And in the form of sofa surfing, you can stay here if you, that kind of thing, or sex for rent, and also across the sector we're seeing women sell sex for the very first time because housing poverty is leaving them with a choice between sexual exploitation and homelessness. So why am I saying that in the context of choice? I think where there's been choice taken away, how someone might present, it can be quite different. Either someone can be very like, I want control back, I want to have a part of my life where I can choose again, or that might present in a way where someone just cannot say no in general, because their no has been so irrelevant that there's a sort of people pleasing, and I might work with women who are kind of will tell me what I want to hear, and I'm just like, you can say no to me and I will respect your no, and I will come alongside you as you choose. And the ability to choose creates kind of a healing environment, so someone can go on choosing, and we need to get ourselves out of the way. and I think there's also an identity, you describe then the kind of victim almost like identity. I think we need to across the board, so I'm talking about abuse more broadly, not say people aren't victims insofar as we're saying things are their fault. I think that's very important, and there can be victim blaming, victim shaming, and that can play out a lot around our narratives around prostitution. So not in that sense. So in that sort of sense, you've been victims of abuse and of a crime, but the identity of victim can keep you in that place of not being able to move forward, or believing that I can't do anything else and I'm not worth anything more. And actually the church can have a real role in creating an environment that either reinforces that victim narrative or not, or creates an environment where someone can thrive and be grow in being who they were created to be.
No, I thought what you said there as well about the importance of letting someone say no as a means of giving them some level of control and power is a really profound idea, actually, isn't it? The kids learn that word early on, and they learn to throw it around at their parents a lot. And that's, as much as it might be frustrating for parents, it's really good for the child, because they're learning they do have some control over the world that they're in. They can say this far and no further to things, or I don't want this, I don't want that. And that's a good lesson for people to learn. I guess people who have been victims of sexual exploitation have had all of their power and dignity robbed of them, to the point that their wishes, their opinions, their desires counted for nothing, so they didn't have any no's left. So I think that's really, as I was reflecting as you're sharing there, Emma, there's lots and lots that's coming to this, kind of spinning around my mind, that I'd love to take things in those different directions. There's lots of ideas and concepts you've thrown out that I think are so fascinating and interesting to explore. I think it'd be really helpful for the listeners to kind of just back up a couple of steps, really, and ask the question, how did this become something that you got involved with? I know I've heard you speak before about some of your story and your engagement with the Me Too movement. Would you mind sharing kind of some of that and how you came to be so involved in this? I know you shared earlier about you having to process your own stuff while also trying to help some of the women in prison.
I mean, I would separate the two things out a little bit. So I think that in terms of working with women involved in sexual exploitation and prostitution, that is something that God really put on my heart. And when I've shared some of my experiences around Me Too, what I don't have is I have experienced sexual exploitation, and I just want to make really, really clear, the levels of trauma are incomparable. So I don't have a story of I have experienced this and therefore it would almost be like saying I work with amputees because I had a paper cut once, and so I understand it's so it would be quite dishonoring to some of the women we work in terms of the levels of trauma, and that goes so deep. And I just there's he put that's something he really put on my heart, and I cried out to God to be used in that area. But I also, in the journey of coming in, he took me on a journey of healing and some of my my pain, I suppose, from what we might now call #MeToo type experiences. And so that partly just from my own healing and my own walk with him, but I needed to get to a place of deeper healing to be able to be to be in this area, and not go to a all men are place in my mind, or it not touch my stuff, which is say comparatively mild but painful nonetheless. So you happy to
tell us about, I guess, things I've heard you say before about your story as it relates to some of this, and why you're particularly passionate about it?
I suppose in terms of the me, in terms of #MeToo, you mean? So I suppose so obviously I spoke about this a bit in different contexts. I'm trying to think of what would be most useful to share in this setting. I think we're familiar with the term #MeToo, I'm assuming, but just in case we aren't, there was a big social media movement really a few years ago following sexual assault allegations of a well-known producer. More and more women start to come forward saying, yeah, me too, that's happened to me, and you know, telling stories of sexual abuse, sexual assault, but also different forms of sexual harassment, and I suppose within that context, you know, I'd had a lot of my own experiences, but it's worth just being just sort of saying that actually the stories that I have shared are very, very, very common. So I if it's helpful, I can share a few of them now, but you know, I afterwards I find a response is either you have a really amazing testimony, or I could have shared that, and not being in a, you know, in a negative, rude way, but just the kind of how common and shared the experience of you know, I've shared some of my own experiences in that context, but actually you know, I probably hold in my mind so many stories of people I know, of friends, of, you know, so and I've shared my own because they're not my stories to share. So I if it's helpful, I can
I think
share some of those.
I think where it's perhaps helpful is for, particularly for men, I suppose, to help us understand what it's like to grow up in a society like this as a young girl, in a culture that is hypersexualized and where women are objectified, and because it's something that as men we just don't appreciate. It's a bit like me asking Owen, what's it like growing up as a black man in this society? I just have no idea as a white guy. So your stories or others, I suppose I'm not asking you to necessarily share things that are particularly vulnerable to you, but just help us understand what it's like to be a woman in this society.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously I don't speak for all women. I think probably for me, I suppose my first kind of experience of an you know, #MeToo type experience, if you like, I was probably I don't know, 12, 13. I would have looked a lot younger, and I would have been dressed like a child because I always look quite young for my age, and I remember being in a shopping centre and a grown man coming up to me and saying, I bet you haven't been broken in yet, I'll break you in, and feeling quite disgusted, but knowing what he, you know, and knowing what he meant, feeling quite, you know, quite scared. And I found that from the, you know, my early mid-teens to early mid 20s, I was constantly being beeped at or having people make very very explicit comments, or being followed home. I've no idea how many times I've been groped by strangers in different contexts during that time. I have experienced men masturbating in front of me in the streets on a number of occasions, and yeah, and then in the context of you know, relationship when I was 17. There's a friend in my school, and he told me that my boyfriend had cheated on me, and then when I was upset, he kind of forced himself on me, and I just kind of froze. And I had different situations of situations switching that was safe, you know, that seemed that, because I think we're quite judgmental. I think sometimes in our language of, you know, someone's got themselves into a certain situation, but we're asking women to risk assess constantly, and you might get it right and you might get it wrong. And so you know, I've had situations switching and having to fight my way away from people a couple of times. So that was my experience, and I became Christian when I was 20. and I didn't really address, I don't think I was ready really, but this didn't come to the surface. I think God's so kind, isn't he? I think he knows what you can cope with. And I think it was after about 4 years of walking with him that all of a sudden the bit of me that was quite numb came to the surface, and it came to the surface with real anger, and also pain, and I was seeing things. So I'd be in coffee with a friend, and I would be able to see it, and and then wanting to kind of scream, get off, that I was feeling it again, and I remember sort of saying, God, why is this happening? And I heard him say, to heal you, I want to bring it up to heal you. So I was praying with a few women over a period of time, and I encountered really God's Father heart for me. I heard him say that to him I was worth what he went through to get me back. And I forgave guys that had hurt me, because that's a gateway to healing, not because I was saying that it was okay, because it wasn't okay. And I think we need to explicitly say that, but because that was a gateway of really of God coming and healing my heart, and healing memories, and those flashbacks stopping, and there was also then a mindset shift. I remember God really convicting me one day of, by the way, my sons that you're hating. And I because I had a real kind of anger, and because that had been shaped by my experience, I had a lot of all men are thought trains, and and we hear, this won't be a surprise, we'd have heard that kind of thing verbalized if we've engaged with any of the Me Too stuff. Often it comes out quite vitriolic, and then we don't engage because it is vitriolic. So so I repented of that, and I started a process of really renewing my mind of, no, men are God's sons, and they're made in his image, and I choose to trust you, God, to bring men into my life. You treat me with respect and dignity, and just praying into that. And that was hard, because I was praying that, and I was meditating on that. You know what it's like when you have a negative thought train. You really need to meditate on truth, but my experience was still difficult. I was still having difficulties with with guys and comments in the street, and being followed home, and that sort of stuff was still happening. So it was difficult, but I was holding on to that. And actually now that is my experience. And obviously I'm older, so circumstantially it's that affects younger women a lot more, but also that I found that to be my truth. And so even when I am because of the church culture that I'm in, because of the men that are around me, because of my relationship with my husband, because also with men that I minister alongside, that I am in that context treated with dignity and respect. And so now when I'm hearing horrendous stories relatively regularly, or reading case notes on referrals of someone's story, it doesn't hit me in that place.
Gosh, wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. I can only begin to imagine, I suppose, how regular experiences like that must shape the way you see yourself and experience your place in the world in a way that I don't expect many men have to experience, in that sense, in the same way that not many white men have to feel the experience of being identified simply by their skin color. And so this is something that I think is really important for people to listen rather than make statements about, and to listen to people's testimonies and experiences without constantly trying to explain it away, because often that's quite a defensive, reactive thing to do. People talk about white fragility. You could have male fragility, like, don't accuse me, I've never done that, and we're not saying not every man has done that. However, what we are saying is, imagine what it's like to live as someone who has to learn to orient themselves in a world where that's a regular part of their experience. I think that must shape your identity and your understanding of yourself in a way that most men, I guess, wouldn't be able to get close to appreciating. So thank you very much for sharing that. And there's lots of I suppose this might be a too big a broader generalized question to ask, but two things, I guess. Do you think it's getting worse, and what do you think the causes are that is creating this culture of sexual, if not sexual exploitation, but certainly sexual objectification, and a license to express oneself and dominate as a man? Do you think that's probably getting worse, and what do you think some of the causes are? Some big questions.
Yes, I suppose it's quite multifaceted. Different. There's the culture side of that. There's the there's the sexual exploitation. I think with I think the culture has already been there. I think it always been there. I think it's playing out in different ways, and so there. Partly because of technology, partly because of social media. I think some trends that we have been seeing, for example, is almost the normalization of violence within sex, and that becoming normalized for children and young people, and how that then plays out in relationships. So what does that look like? So pre-lockdown, for example, we were seeing growing trends of child on child sexual assault. So I think when we think of sexual assault, we think kind of, I don't know, middle-aged guys, actors. I'm not saying he doesn't exist, but what we're seeing is child on child sexual assault. Why? Because of the accessibility of porn, and because of the prevalence of high levels of violence in what children read. And I say children because it's children of kind of 9 years old are engaging with some of this, and it's not that they're bad kids, it's just that it's so accessible. And so they're first, before they've their brains are developed, and before they've even shaped views of sex and relationships and what that looks like, they are looking at an assault essentially. And sometimes they're literally looking at assault because porn sites post actual images of assaults, or it's being played out. So we are then seeing correlation with those kinds of things either being played out within relationships, and it being what children and young people are beginning to think is expected of them. So it's not that these are children from broken homes. It's more just that this is what they have been exposed to, and that then becomes wired into their thinking. And we were already seeing an increase in very, very violent sexual encounters or sexual assault becoming normalized. I think now, since lockdown, see, the situation is that we've got children and young people at home, on separate from other children and young people, where they might build relationships with. There have been, some of the major porn sites have almost been communicating that they are doing a public service by what they're providing, and so that then is likely to play out in different ways. Wow. And so I know that sort of sounds quite heavy to engage with, but that I think there's a big trend around normalization of violence, and I've been reflecting a lot on how do we engage. So there's the church obviously can be a place. We need to have an awareness of this to be able to really engage to a place of healing when people are coming into our churches, but also something that really is on my heart is prevention, because I think by the time that we really touch these topics, it's later on in youth, it's already a ministry issue. If it's an issue, it's already an issue, and it's an ingrained issue. Now, I'm not suggesting we suddenly start having horrible conversations with children in our kids' work, but there is something about how do we equip parents to be able to parent in a way to address some of these things at prevention stage, so that they are prepared for the moment when they are exposed, because it's more likely that they will be than they won't, in terms of the so that's something that's very much on my heart at the moment. How do we explore healthy biblical relationships, but also healthy relationships, so that we start to create a culture, because otherwise the norm of what will be shaped by a highly sexualized culture.
And I don't know if you've read Nancy Pearcey. You come across her as an author, but she I was just looking through one of her books recently, and she says that the trouble is you've got this kind of there seems to be a lot of contradictions in society in the way that we are talking about relationships between men and women. On the one hand, you've got the hookup culture and the prevalence of that sex is nothing, it's just an act between two people. So it just doesn't need to involve your emotions, on the one hand. On the other hand, we've got the hashtag Me Too response, saying how awful it is that people have just treated their bodies like they're just a bodily act rather than a heart reaction. And Nancy Pearcey was saying part of the issue is that we treat sex education like a how-to manual, really just about our biology and what to do with what, and we've detached it from relationship, and we've detached it from the important. And actually, I thought it was a fascinating comment about lockdown, and they're now being socialized by what they're seeing online rather than what they're doing in their playgrounds. And so children, for us as adults, you think, well, it's only a few months, but for my 4-year-old, he's been under lockdown for nearly a quarter of his life. And that's shocking. Like, that has a big impact on him and his world in a way that, again, we won't appreciate as adults what it's like. Do you see many of those same kind of contradictions? Because of course you've also got the expression of female sexual power, if you like, in 50 Shades of Grey, which was very popular a few years ago. And even the kind of popular Netflix series Bridgerton seems to be, again, about female sexual expression, but it seems also to be quite a male vision of sexual expression. I don't know I'd love to get your thoughts on a lot of those comments, popular culture, its contradictions, and how that's perhaps shaping the way we think about things.
It's very very complex. I think that the idea of empowerment is a very complex one, isn't it? Because there's the power being taken away in the moment where, say, if someone's sexually assaulted, in that moment there's a power dynamic going on. You've crossed over somebody's no, and there's often the pushback of this, of like, no, I have control over my body, and I can, and then that can go to a place of, and I will express it in a certain way. And so you might see a celebrity, for example. I think there was a celebrity who was in a revenge porn situation, as in, when someone's being there's a sort of bribery or revenge. I'm going to post this intimate picture, and her response was, I'm going to take control back and post the picture anyway. And then and then judgment coming in. And I think that's probably an example of where you might see that that dynamic being played out, of the control being taken away, and then a way of pushing back is, no, I have control over my body. And then there's the sort of so I think we need to understand the and we react to that, of course, but we need to understand the nature of control being taken away, and like the history of that. So I mean, this is centuries of different ways of control over someone's body being taken away, whether that's domestic violence, or so-called honor-based killings, or FGM, or female genital mutilation, or prostitution, or rape, or however it looks like. There's different examples of that, of control being taken away, and the pain of that. And so there's a lot. I think this isn't the only, it's a very multifaceted question, but that this is one aspect of that narrative of a response being, no, I'm going to take control back and you know, kind of that, and therefore have, you know, control over my sexuality. That is a response. And I think we can go from one extreme socially to another extreme, but I think we need to kind of understand almost the narratives of both, be able to minister with compassion. I think also if the, you know, if the women and girls that are being told in particular, and this is not exclusively, because men can struggle with these issues too, you know, and boys can struggle, but women and girls in particular told from a very young age, your identity is in your sexuality, this is who you are, from a very young age. I mean, you see that from hypersexualized dancing and you know, in videos that are aimed at children, really, and you know, in a whole myriad of ways. And then the external kind of thing, you get this message of that is where your value is, that if you are language, you know, we're hearing at the moment, if you were sassy, but if you were that kind of thing, if this is your you know, this is your identity, and that is where your value is, and then attention coming there, and that message gets ingrained in all sorts of different ways. And then as soon as she behaves in line with that, we start shaming and we start attacking, and that message of you are worth nothing more comes again, but from a different angle. And again, I suppose I've talked about this in the past, but a church can be a real place of healing, and actually men within church can be a real vehicle of healing by the way that they relate. I mean, you know, often talk about the 1 Timothy 2 family, you know, treating older men like fathers, younger men like brothers, mothers and sisters, you know, that family image. And you know, we talk about that in terms of purity and boundaries, and that is really important, of course, but also we need to recognize that part of that is that there is a relationship. There is a relationship with boundaries, but there is a relationship, and there is something about, you know, men interacting with women in a non-sexualized way, you know, is very, very powerful, because then that communicates you are valued for who you are as a person. And I think sometimes in fear we can be so, you know, we can be so distant that actually we reinforce that same lie that the only way men can interact with women is sexually, or not at all. And men can have a real role, really powerful role in changing and shaping culture. Just a story came to mind on that, actually, for me, just to kind of describe how that what that might look like. I remember like 12 years ago when I was doing that project with, you know, outreach in off-street prostitution, so going into flats. It was really well run, and we had this wonderful training course that looked quite in depth at different aspects of, you know, personal safety or sexual exploitation. And we had a session that was looking at the demand side of paying for sex. And so it's quite hot because for me, I was grappling with some of these things, and I went into this session, and I think the stat that they gave was 1 in 10 men had paid for sex in their lifetimes, and I think now it's 11% of 16 to 70, so it's quite static stats. And so that was kind of hitting home, and there was a guy who was on the training, and I heard a male voice saying, that is totally unacceptable. And that, for me, he didn't know this, he didn't know me, he was on the other side of the room. God did a real moment of healing in my heart in that moment, because yes, that is totally unacceptable, but there was a male voice saying that. And not only was that kind of you know, healing for me, and starting in with kind of reworking the all men are, it actually changed culture in that moment, because it wasn't it wasn't that all men are, it's that brokenness can play out in a particular way, but that is not you know, what God says about his sons. And actually so it's something very powerful about a man shaping culture. So we've seen a lot of women's voices on Me Too, and sometimes that can make us feel uncomfortable. Sometimes, you know, that might, you know, we might be scared or whatever, but there's something very powerful when that men's voices join with women's on this topic, and you know, and different aspects of our, bless you, different aspects of our culture saying, actually no, this is not this is not okay, and that is not how masculinity and femininity needs to play out within our context.
Because I imagine it can be very easy, as you said, to get into that trap of vilifying men. All men are, and equally men, you know, as much as women need to be transformed by the renewal of their mind about who they are and their identity and where their potency and power and agency in the world comes from. So do men, because you know, men are taught from a young age, as soon as testosterone really kicks in at puberty, this is a big part of who you are. You use it to fight or to dominate, and actually looking at porn and pursuing women sexually is just part of being a man. And so men can play into that and think, well, that gives me permission to behave badly because my culture says that's what men do, through the messages that they send out. But it does strike me as interesting that by and large in society, up until recently, you might say, I don't know, but there seems to be one key message that's sent to women about where their power can come from, and it is in their appearance and sexuality, whereas for men, power can come in lots of ways, through their use of their intellect, or through their physical strength and their muscles, or through their competency in their jobs, or their humor. And so it does seem the scales and the balance do seem to be slightly tipped against women in this regard, that there isn't too many visions of where power and identity and purpose can come from for a woman. And so I do appreciate that this isn't all things being equal kind of conversation, because all things aren't equal in that regard. But I'd love to just get your comment then on how we avoid vilifying men, because I am also aware that in the church sometimes we can be guilty of going the other way, to the point that we present femininity as holiness and masculinity as sinful, or we talk about we talk about the sins of the flesh, as though they are largely things that men struggle with and men have a problem with, and men need to stop this and men need to stop that. And I think a lot of men avoid churches because they think, well, I'm basically told to become an emasculated version of myself, or to become a slightly more feminine version of myself, and that doesn't seem a particularly desirable vision of male flourishing. So again, it's not a straightforward question. I'm not looking to you to be the guru of all things on this, but it'd be really interesting just to hear your comment on how we avoid vilifying men, and how we can present a vision of masculinity to men that is attractive but doesn't look like becoming a woman.
That's interesting. I think there's I suppose a few initial thoughts. I think one is that I think we do need to be clear that, you know, within our churches and the way that we talk about sex with young people and things like that, that it's not, lust isn't purely a male issue. You know, women struggle with lust, and actually increasingly, in research, in different settings, pastorally, women are can struggle with pornography, and so that's something that's probably worth knowing, that we're not too and we're seeing boys struggle with body image. So I think we do need to probably hold that in the way that we minister. In terms of the masculinity, I know what you mean. I think when there was, do you remember at the turn of the millennium, you're probably the right age range, I would imagine, the Millennium Man. I don't know if you remember that. There was this idea of the Millennium Man, and it was that kind of slightly softer, slightly more effeminate, had a man bag, that kind of thing. So there was this kind of narrative about that, and then there was a lot of pushback, I think, from men of kind of feeling a bit emasculated, and so that that you can go from one extreme to the other, kind of being the power dynamics of women experiencing different forms of gender-based violence, and saying that is enough, we need to address this, and then going to the other extreme where then men don't feel they can do anything. So I think what we need to distinguish between is your identity as a man, identity as a woman, and how brokenness and how sin can often play out, and there's a real distinction. So that kind of the sort of toxic things that so when we are exploring, when we're unpacking, you know, things like pornography, things like you know, sexualization, these kinds of topics, you might hear pastorally, I don't know about you, but I've certainly come across this, come on, that's just what guys are like. And you know, you might hear men articulating that, but you also might hear women articulating that. So, and you know, and it's same in some ways, it can be sort of seen as, you know, we need to protect men, but actually that view is doing men a real disservice, and it's a slightly window dressed version of that same lie that I talked about walking out of myself, of this is what men are like. Because when we do that, when we say, you know, this is just what men are like, we are, that in itself is almost disempowering men to be able to walk out of things. So what do I mean by that? I'm not talking about physiological drive. I'm not making a comment about that. I'm not talking about, you know, hormones. That's not what I'm, or you know, or retraction. I don't mean that. I mean when that we start using that to justify objectifying women, we start using that to justify these kinds of things that all of these movements are speaking out against, then we are minimizing all of what men can be. So because there's a difference between this is a common struggle, but I am a child, I'm a child of God, and I you know, and I can choose to, well, this is just my identity, it's who I am, and therefore you know, I have to watch porn, and therefore I have to do this. And that in itself, I think, is disempowering. So I think that's where the strength comes, is kind of realizing who you are, and not all men are abusive, or all men have to watch pornography because that's who they are. Actually, that men are more powerful than that, because you're made in God's image, because his spirit is in you, because you're being transformed day by day more and more into his likeness. That's not saying there isn't a struggle, but the struggle and the sin and the brokenness, that is not who you are. Just like when I described earlier that identity of victim, that is not who you are. And it's at that moment when when I'll say women, but obviously men, you know, do experience abuse. It's important to acknowledge that. When she realizes that she is not a victim, that is almost a real catalyst in healing. I think when he realizes that power doesn't come in the toxic version of masculinity, but more in realigning with what does God say about you as his child. I think that is a key thing in walking that out.
That's beautiful, because I do think there's something that this is how Christianity changed the world, in that it gave a vision to men that elevated self-control and self-sacrifice above what we might term today as self-expression and just power. You know, that we are not just animals. We have, to just alliterate, we have angel as well as animal in us. We have the propensity to something bigger than just hormonal reaction and instinct. And I think there does seem to be that contradiction in society that wants to seem to hold on to this, you're special, you're a human being, but it does that by saying you're also just an animal, so you can embrace your appetites, and your sexual urge is an appetite like your desire for hunger and food. So I think what you're saying there is absolutely beautiful. There's that need to restate what's fundamentally Christian, that we're called to be like Christ, who, though he was in the form of God, did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he used his power and his access to strength and power. He used it to serve and humble himself and die, rather than lord it over others, as Jesus says, like the Gentiles do. But to be truly great is to serve and die. And I think that which kind of tacks into that question of, you know, how do we create a vision that counters the vision of sexual expression that's gained traction in our society over the last few decades. Is this vision of the Christian story, again, is a much more beautiful story of human flourishing than the secular story of what we might say self-expression. So thank you for those comments. And Emma, why don't we come on to just having you share with us a bit about the work of Orchards and what you're doing there.
So we work specifically with women who've experienced different forms of sexual exploitation. So that might be trafficking for sexual purposes, that might be prostitution, or that playing out in different ways. So we were founded out of a real foundation of prayer. Really, it's something that I'd carried in my heart for a long time, as I've said. And about 8 years ago, I was working in an organisation with another woman, and we were both doing outreach in different areas in London. And we started praying together initially to see if we could do something where we were, and then became prayer partners. And so we would just, would be a kind of our regrouping in a lunchtime prayer partners. And there was this moment where the Holy Spirit fell, and he spoke really, really, really clearly to us about, now it was time to do something. And it was almost like I just found out I was pregnant at work, and I was coming back to my desk because I was carrying something so much. Maybe people can see, is that I think he spoke to us so clearly. And there was a period then of us praying and checking with people and researching and talking to people we knew in the sector. And we knew that housing was an issue. We knew that lack of housing was one of the biggest reasons for entry into prostitution, one of the biggest barriers to exit. And so after 5 years really of praying and consulting and talking to different people, we set up a safe housing provision for women exiting, linked to a local church, and also trauma counselling, because often the longest lasting effects are the sort of psychological effects, and PTSD, eating disorders, relational issues, anxiety, those kind of things, very, very, very common. So we run safe 1-bedroom flats, counselling with a Christian counsellor who specialises in sexual trauma, and support work that links to job opportunities. It links to CAP and food bank. It links to work placements. We're looking at nutrition. Lots of women we're working with have eating issues as a way of processing trauma. And since lockdown, we initially did a lot of video counselling and casework and pastoral care. So we kind of lean into the local church for pastoral care, and we set up another. We've managed quite a few moves. So I've done lots of kind of lifting boxes with gloves and masks and that sort of thing. Wow. And we're launching a remote support service. So a lot of counselling services can be quite focused in the south of the UK. So we, from doing video counselling, we started to get referrals from women around the country. So we're exploring that at the moment. Now, something that we've been looking at a lot over the last year is really creating bridges into the local church. I think that's something that is very much on our hearts from the beginning. I think the local church is essential to our model, so we wouldn't set up a safe house that wasn't linked to a local church and do a social action thing. And we've been, going deeper in that, and that's still a journey we're on. So we're looking at we're trying as much as possible to create bridges from the local church through kind of mission opportunities for people to get involved. We link into some of our other, what we might call growth centre ministries at church, so CAP and food bank. And also opportunities for women to explore faith and ways of doing that. So we've talked a lot about choice, haven't we, just since we've been chatting, and the importance of choice. And that's something that we've been grappling with the best ways of doing, because I've talked about different ways that choice has been taken away, and actually some women might have been exploited in a faith-based setting, or Bible verses used in a manipulative way. Some women might have had just really broken experiences around faith, and we want to create we don't ever make "you must come to a Bible study" part of what we do, because just as someone would it might have been in a survival sex situation around housing. So I'm selling sex for my housing. If a woman felt that she might lose her housing because of her engagement or not in a faith-based activity, then that's kind of becomes exploitative all over again. That said, real transformation and healing comes with an encounter with a Father, comes with a relationship with Jesus, and we don't want to it to be a social action project. So we create as many relational connection points. There's that. We make it really clear before women come that we work in partnership with a local church, that we are a Christian project. Their choice to engage or not is will no way affect the support that they receive. It's unconditional. So there's that choice, but that they are welcome, and that we're an organisation who pray, and we'd love to be praying for you. And if you'd like prayer at any point, we'd love to pray with you, but you don't have to. And creating as many relational links. Everyone who's involved has a strong faith. And what we found by having that tension of keeping the local church at the heart, but keeping choice is really key. Found people having an encounter with God in a session, and suddenly they're exploring faith with me, and now we're going prayer walking regularly. Wow. We've found women coming to us, and before we even mention anything, they're saying, "Oh, I heard you're Christian. Have you got a Bible study I can come to?" I'm like, "I don't know. Let's make one. Yeah, sure. we'll create one. Come to that." And so that kind of we're seeing women coming with a real hunger for God, and there's more seeking because it's their choice, and it's not and it's their yes. And with some women are reiterating again, you don't have to apologize if you haven't come to something. It's okay. It's your choice. And so in that environment, we're seeing the first fruits really of God starting to meet with women, and in some cases old faiths being reignited, or new relationships with God starting to be built. And so when we're looking at remote service of reaching women in different parts of the country with counselling, and something we're looking at the moment is how can we link to the wider church? How can we still make sure that isn't something that is cut off from the heartbeat of God's church, but linked with churches around the country? And we within the church context where our safe housing is, we're doing a lot with the church around pastoral care, around safeguarding, around just equipping leaders to be able to pastor in this context, and also because of the volume of domestic abuse issues that are coming through from people in the local community. Really equipping leaders on these issues, and then you're in a stronger place to include someone who has experienced sexual exploitation into a church family.
That's beautiful. And like you said often throughout our conversation, just the power of the local church family to reculturate us, to train the way we think about members of the opposite sex differently. It strikes me that the gospel is always incarnational. The transformative power of the gospel is always going to be worked out in relationship, and that begins with you encountering them, your encounter with them, but it extends to the family of God that is the hands and feet of Jesus. So I love that. I love the vision. I love what you're doing, and I'm so grateful really just for your courage and being willing to have conversations like this, and to be someone who's soft enough that the Holy Spirit can help you see that not all men are like that. That's a beautiful story as well. So thank you so much for all that you're doing. As we draw to a close, is there anything just bubbling on your heart that you wanted to share before we finish?
I think something that came to mind in the question you asked about 10 minutes ago around the strength and masculinity and all of that. I think something that just came into my heart was just that that in addressing this, it is not about dumbing down your strength or kind of minimizing it. Actually, it's about using it. There's something very powerful about how you use your strength, because there's there's obviously the gender wars, which don't really get anywhere, and they go one way and they go another way. But how powerful it is when men use their voices to bring challenge in this. What would it look like if you were to use your strength in that way? How powerful it is when men change the culture of, like, actually, no, this is not okay. There's something about actually realizing not how weak you are, but how strong you are to be able to change culture. What does it look like when someone comes into the church and every experience they've had of guys has been negative, but they are spoken to with respect, and someone engages with them intellectually? What would it look like if you had a church culture where men and women are ministering alongside each other, using the gifts that God has given them, and someone is brought into that culture and is seen not as a victim or a testimony trophy, but they are seen for who they are. And so that, I think that is something just to leave us by, actually, is kind of realizing how powerful we are to create culture change because of the Holy Spirit in us.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. And I remember I heard someone say that actually asking women in this situation, or black people in the conversation about race, asking the women to be the voice of change is quite sick, because it's like asking the victims to be the ones who overthrow their oppressors all the time, whereas it should be about empowering the leaders to take responsibility in the church to change a culture that doesn't necessarily affect them directly, because they're not the ones who live with this experience day in, day out, but they're the ones who, like Christ, step up and take responsibility for another's challenges and do what they can to change things for that person's benefit, without asking them to summon the courage all the time to be the testimony, to be the voice. If they want to, great, but we shouldn't be looking necessarily to them to be the ones who are the vehicles of change. God gives the church elders for that reason, to be the men who lay down their lives for the flock, even though they don't necessarily experience all the same challenges that every person in their community and congregation does. So that's what's in my mind as we finish. But Emma, thank you so much for your time. I know you've got to dash and get the kids from school, so I'm just conscious of the clock. I'm really grateful, and I'd love to have you back at some time in the future, because I'm sure there's lots more we could talk about. And I pray God blesses you. By the way, if anybody wants to find out more about Orchards, there'll be linked to all of Emma's work in the description to today's episode, and so you can contact her and engage with the work that she's doing. Thanks, Emma.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's fun.